I'm going to put this display initial on these paragraphs here, but before I do, I want you to take a second. I'll give you a second to think about it, or pause the video and see if you can think of what's actually going to happen when I do this. What's going to change? What's going to stay the same? Keep it in mind. And in 3, 2, 1, here we go. And is that what you were expecting? Some of you probably got it right, but for a lot of people, you probably weren't expecting exactly that. And if that's the case and you want to know what happened and other things you could use instead of initial that would behave more like you think they would, then stick around because that's exactly what this video is going to be about. Hi there, my front-end friends, and welcome back to the channel. I'm so glad that you've come to join me today. And if you are new to my channel, my name is Kevin, and here at my channel, I help you fall madly, deeply in love with CSS. And if not deeply in love with it, at least you hate it a little bit less. Just before we dive into it, I want you to take a moment to comment down below and let me know if you got it right before I set that paragraph to initial, if you guessed right, or if you knew what was actually going to happen there or not. So leave a comment down below. Be honest about it. It's okay when we get things wrong because we're all here to learn, and part of learning is getting things wrong and learning from that. And yeah, we're here to learn about initial and why it's probably not what you want to be doing or using, and what you actually probably want to be using is either unset or revert. So let's dive into the code and see how all of these things actually work. All right, so here we go. And as you can see, I've put together a really, really ugly page for this one, and we're going to use this to explore initial and what it actually does and the other properties, or not properties, but the other values that we have instead of it. So the first thing is, you can see I've styled some buttons here, and see these are actually outlines on here, just little tangent. Outlines are now getting border radiuses on them. This is in Chrome Canary, so it hasn't made the main Chrome yet, but it's on the way there, which is super exciting. And if you were at my last live stream with Adam Argyle, then he's the one who let me know these are on the way, which is super cool. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is look at this button that we have right here. So we have these 3 buttons that I've done, and this is a button very different because sometimes this happens. You style things in a very specific way. All of your buttons are something, and then you need to get away from that. And if you didn't know, we have an all keyword that we can actually use, or an all keyword, it's a property. So we have the all property, which just selects every single property, and that's often not useful, but then maybe what you'll do is an initial on there, initial. And when we do that, it sort of goes back to not initial though, right? Because often what people think initial does is to reset it as if we didn't do anything. But that's not what's actually happening here, because if we hadn't done anything, we're going to see how we can actually do that. But if we hadn't done anything, then it would look like a normal button. But it doesn't look like a button. It's actually resetting it further than that. And the thing that's weird about initial is, we're going to scroll down a little bit. Let's go down to this other section, a different section here. And I'm going to go to here, section very different star, which is just selecting everything that's inside of this section. And I'm going to say the same thing, all, and we'll do initial first. And we're going to see, you got to spell things right if you want them to work. All initial, and you can see here that section is completely different. So I had a container, got rid of my container doing anything, but I had multiple paragraphs in here, just like we saw at the beginning. They're all strung together. The font has been reset as you'd sort of expect there, but what the initial does is it actually looks at different ones. So before we looked at display initial, and even, we could even, should we muck things up even more? Look at this. We're just going to do a star and do a display initial. Watch the initial. Watch the craziness that this will do, where we can even see my CSS showing up, because it's even taking the head, and we're seeing things. There's the title. So what the initial keyword is doing is it's not looking at what it's being applied to. So let's get rid of this because it's all kind of weird. And what it's doing is it's looking at display, but it's not looking at that this is or even let's just do paragraphs now, so it's a little bit more clear. So there we go. It's not looking at what it's styling. It's just going to the display property and going into the spec, what's the initial value of the display property? And the initial value of the display property is inline. And that's before we get to like the user agent styles that actually say, no, a paragraph should be block and all of that. We're going beyond that. We're ignoring what the element is, and we're just resetting everything to like the real core in the spec of every single property. So that's why initial usually doesn't do what you actually want it to do, and it can turn things inline. It can do all sorts of strange stuff. Like here, where it's just completely reset my button. So this is where we have other options. Like I said, we have onset and we have revert. Onset is the first one that we got because I've been doing this for a long time. We used to only have initial, and this is like, I was doing this when we were making table-based layouts. We only had initial, so we just, and in certain cases you could use it for certain properties. I wouldn't use it on the all though, just because it does crazy stuff. But all initial, and instead of that we can use an onset. And you'll notice that onset is going to do some things similarly, but some things different, where we still have my button. My outline is showing up just because that's styled on the hover and stuff. We're not going to worry about that. But you'll notice the font is different, but the font size and the color and all that have come in. So let's just do all onset here, just so we can comment things on and off if we feel like we need to. So what the difference between onset and initial is, onset will look if the property is traditionally inherited or not. So in this case, normally the font family, so font family or the color, are inherit. So instead of going all the way back and setting things to like that crazy thing where it's going back to black, it's like going back to the original like everything, where it's not even inheriting anything. There's no inheritance happening now for color, for font size, for font family. All of that is out the window. Whereas if we do an all onset, it's going to set anything that should be inherited or that normally is inherited. It will still be inherited. Now you might be saying, but Kevin, like buttons normally don't inherit anyway. And I know that, but let's say we come on my paragraph here and I just say all initial. You'll see that like all my paragraphs here, they're going to go back to black, and you can see they're becoming inline. It's just going to like default city. It's not using, so we lose a lot of the power of CSS when we use initial because that inheritance is gone. So that's onset, which sets things back. Now for a lot of things, like say even here we did display is onset, it's going to behave just like we saw before, where it's going to make it all inline because the display property is not something that's inherited. So if something is not inherited, then it just goes back to that factory reset of the display property, not for my paragraphs themselves. And that's not the greatest thing in the world, but just so we know, that's what it does. And this was sort of the next stage along the way. It's, in my opinion, better than initial, but it's still a little bit heavy-handed, as you can see there, where some things you might have unintended consequences sometimes. Or then there's the one that you probably want to be using this entire time, though sometimes maybe onset is the right call. And so that's where we have an all, and I'm just doing all. We don't have to always do it on an all, but it sort of really shows what's happening. We have the revert, and I'm leaving these on just because, like, this is replacing this one because the order of the cascade here. So all revert, look, it's gone back to being a default button, just like you'd expect it to be. And this is the really cool one, and I love revert. And what it's basically doing is get rid of any styles that are applied on it, but go back to the user agent styles that we would have started with if there was no CSS applied here in the first place. Whereas onset sort of strips things back a little bit further than that. This is really the revert keyword here as a value is going to what's the user agent style doing and ignore the CSS that was previously applied by the author who's authoring the CSS. And this is often what we think initial is actually doing. So if you do need something like this, revert can be really useful. So sometimes you might want the onset, other times you might want revert. It depends on which one you want to do. Maybe you try one, you try the other, but I really do think that most of the time you don't want to be using initial. And if you've learned a thing or two during this video, I have a little playlist for you right here of other CSS properties that often catch people off guard that you can check out. And with that, a really big thank you to Zach, Randy, and Stuart, who are my supporters of Awesome over on Patreon, as well as all my other patrons for their monthly support. And of course, until next time, don't forget to make your corner of the internet just a little bit more awesome.